It was great to be here. I have to say it's definitely weird when you walk into a place and the first thing you see is your mug on a large screen TV. It's a bit cognitive dissonance, but it's wonderful to be here. It's great to be talking with a crowd like yourselves. Oftentimes when I talk at conferences, it's a lot of people within the advertising industry, sometimes data focused, but it's not often that I get to talk with people who really focus on actually building the platforms that we talk about every day. The infrastructure that makes things happen, the people who are actually developing the applications, and a lot of really smart engineering brains. So the IQ is about 40 points higher than I'm used to, so please allow me, if I do make some mistakes, please have mercy on me. As Nandita was saying, my name is Ian Beecraft. I am the VP Group Director of Creative Technology and Digital Strategy. It is a mouthful, say it 5 times fast and you'll be 4 hours late. I got my start, again, in music and actually pre-med. I decided I did not have the patience for 8 years of school, so instead I took 6 to get my undergrad done and finished with entrepreneurship. I did a couple of startups and then got into the ad industry, mostly because I was focused on building mobile applications and actually doing a mobile production shop. So have some familiarity with a lot of the work that many of you were working on. However, the game's changed a bit since 2009, 2010, in case you haven't noticed. What I talk about today and what I focus on is helping new and emerging brands work with new and emerging technologies, but also actually adapt to the challenges of today's business climate. The problem with what's happening today is a lot of businesses approach things as if they're linear. They talk about the challenges of today and tomorrow and think there's a direct line between the two of them, but they don't anticipate the fact that technology is moving much, much quicker. So a lot of what you'll see in this presentation is focused on that, kind of changing the lens at which we look at change and the business climate and helping clients look at things a little bit differently so they can solve the problems that actually matter for them. And when I start, oh, there we go. What's that? We could just actually stare at this photo for a while. Awesome, thank you. All yours. Perfect, thank you. So got to see the cool slide first before we move on. For those of you on Twitter, I highly recommend hitting me up on Twitter as we go through with questions, and I'll make sure I pull up my phone towards the end, or at least I'll log into Twitter because I think I left my phone back there, to answer any questions you might have. Personally, it's hard for me to remember what questions I have all the way towards the end of a half-hour presentation, so feel free to hit me up there. Also, if there's any resources you want me to send to you via email, Twitter's the best way to at me, and then I'll send you some extra information on some of the things I talk about. I talk about a lot of resources, books, technologies in this talk, so if you want more of that, I'm happy to get back to you personally on these things. So let's talk about probably the most overplayed phrase in the industry, and that's disruption, the idea of embracing disruption. And there's this phrase that a lot of thought leaders use saying, if you're not the disruptor, you're being disrupted. And forgive my language, but I kind of call bullshit on that phrase for one reason. It doesn't allow me to do anything with it. There's this idea that it's a zero-sum game. You're either going to be the winner or you're going to be the loser. Disruption's a constant. It's not just an equation. It's not something that just either happens or it doesn't. And what I like to do is focus on how we can look at disruption, change the way our relationship with it so we don't understand it as an enemy, but it's actually something that we can embrace, especially with what you're doing. A lot of the work that you do here is helping customers embrace that disruption, help them transform their own companies to adopt the challenges of modern day life. That's just a simple fact of the way we work today. And this talk is about two different things, mindsets and tools. I start with mindsets because if you don't understand how to look at a problem, the tool set's worthless. You can't use the wrong programming language in the wrong environment and get something worthwhile. It's the same thing with the way that we're wired to look at challenges. And as human beings, we have some difficulty with that. Then I'll get to some tool sets and how those can be applied to these challenges. When I look at the makeup of the average modern organization, there's often a division between the two types of people. There are those that plan and those that make. those actually create the structure for those others to follow, and those who are the ones actually responsible for creating. And the organizations I feel are making the most progress and having the most impact have a blurred line between the two. There may be a separate function in between both of those, but there's a lot of crossover, and at times, it's almost impossible to tell the two apart. In my team, I have strategists, developers, creatives, all in the same team, whereas an average agency doesn't have those in the same team. There is a creative leader, there's a development leader, there is a strategy leader. We specifically have all of them on the same team, and sometimes I'll put them in situations where I won't describe to the team lead who's doing what. The account leader will ask, okay, who's creative technology, who's strategy, who is creative? I won't tell them because I want them both to do it. It's that middle line where you get to understand the context of what the other person is doing, and by being able to both make and plan, create and strategize, you understand the context of the wider challenge you are about to embrace and that you're about to solve for. Just saying, I'm only responsible for the planning or I'm only responsible for the making, it means that there's not a responsibility to each other or the process. And it's at the intersection of those two things that we get an opportunity to play. Our process is three things. It's think, play, create. Especially when you're looking at new and emerging technologies, things that haven't gotten full traction or haven't become legacy at this point. There's still things that we haven't understand the full gravity of yet. Things like augmented reality and virtual reality. They have a common place in the public conscious. People know about them. They're excited about them, but not everybody knows what it's like to actually interact with them. Almost everyone's done something in augmented reality, whether they know it or not. Very few people have done anything in virtual reality. But what my team does is even the strategists get an opportunity to build for these tools. Even the creatives get a chance to understand the UX and the strategic environment of how you design a full experience around one of these. And if you can't do that, you can't really relate to the other people you're going to be working with that are helping you solve the challenges. And the play portion is so critical to understanding the future of technology, because if you're not playing with these things, if you're not having fun with these things, if you're not being passionately curious about how they work or what they can do for you, you'll stay where you are. It creates stagnation. It doesn't allow you to drive what's going to be next for yourself and for others. If you're not passionately curious about something, you're not likely to invest in it, and then you can't get other people excited about it either. And as a team, we're kind of the central point for that. And I'm sure many of you are exactly the same within your organization and for the customers that you serve. You know more about this than anyone else in the organizations that you serve. So being able to be passionately curious about what you're doing, what's next for you, and what's next for your client, helps kind of diffuse that excitement and that knowledge throughout organizations. So when I talk about new and emerging technologies and the impact they might have, one of the exercises I do starts with this image. And I'm going to ask you to bear with me and do something very silly. If I ask you what this is, what's the average answer? Acorns. Simple. It's exactly what it is. Then I'm going to shift the lens a bit and say, okay, you know what this is. What potentially could it become? What does an acorn become? A tree. An oak tree, to be specific. So I'm going to extrapolate from there to something a little bit wider. I'm going to widen that lens to almost a universal perspective. Okay, so we've got, I'm going to change it from what is it to what could it be, then what's the impact that could have. So it's an acorn. I plant it, it becomes an oak tree. Oak tree then creates even more. So eventually it could become a forest of oak trees, which then becomes a home and habitat for animals, which then can attract opportunities for other life. So humans could actually move into an area where they have access to animals, shelter, food. Acorns actually can become food for those animals, which allows the humans then again to use the environment to their advantage for creating food, shelter, clothing. As a society, they start to grow. Ultimately, those acorns could become a currency as they travel to other civilizations in different areas. All of a sudden, we have trade. Trade creates interchange between cultures. That creates a difference in language and understanding. Eventually, that could also create conflict and war. I got there from acorns. That was a little bit ludicrous, but at the same time, it's an opportunity to play. It's an opportunity to step outside the lens of what you would typically expect when you look at something. I look at something, I usually see what it is. But to understand the future of technology and of culture, you have to look at something and understand what can be. What I just did is a very condensed version of what a lot of futurists end up doing. Futurists will take a number of exercises, sometimes days or weeks, to get to an extrapolation like that, but it's also using exponential steps instead of linear steps to get from point A to point B. Let's do that with something a little more familiar, a little more relevant to our times. This is a smartphone camera circa 2005. Doesn't look like much, but to get there from the 1970s version of the Kodak digital camera, which was 0.01 megapixels, we had to take a lot of steps. Essentially, we took a camera, a film camera, put zeros and ones behind it, and all of a sudden we had this massive $75,000 piece of equipment, which had an absolute garbage product. Then it started to double over time. Gotta love Moore's law. And doubling from 0.01 to 0.02 to 0.04, all that still looks like zero for a very long time, and all of a sudden it just shoots through the roof. Then we get products that are much smaller, much more powerful. Even with this, there's still a long time to go before we can do anything besides document with it. So we've given it zeros and ones. We've given it access to things like storage. We've given it connectivity to the world around us through things like wireless. All of a sudden, the lens at which a camera is looked at, what it can do, changes. It's not just documenting photos and videos anymore. You can actually use your camera to overlay something on top of the world, and you get augmented reality. Augmented reality then starts to change the way that we interact on things like social. How many posts on Instagram stories do you see are done through lenses and selfie filters now? It's actually a large proportion of that kind of stuff, and it changes the way that we interact with the people around us. So something as simple as connecting a camera to zeros and ones eventually changed the way that we communicate with each other. And that's a large step to get from one to the next, and it's hard to see where that's going to go unless you're looking at the convergence of trends from multiple areas and looking at each one of them individually to see where they might eventually intersect and understanding the implications of all of those together. If you're interested in learning more about that style of thinking, there are two great books I recommend. There's a whole library of them, but The Signals Was Talking, written by Amy Webb, is a whole book on exercises and thought exercises and things that you can do to create much more robust versions of that thought exercise we just did a few minutes ago. And then Tom Goodwin's Digital Darwinism. I know Ruggie likes to quote from Tom Goodwin. It's about, he's famous for the phrase of the largest car company in the world has no cars, the largest retail in the world has no inventory. He wrote an amazing book. He's also my favorite curmudgeon. He's very cynical, but he's got a great sense of humor. But those are two fantastic books if you're looking to get more information on how to think that way. Moving with the idea of exponential change is this law called Martek's law. How many of you are familiar with the concept of Martek's law? Is anyone here familiar with that? So it's a law that essentially states technology moves exponentially, but organizations move logarithmically. Personally, I think humans tend to move very linearly, so we can draw another line right here. And it's that difference, that friction right there that's causing a lot of the heartburn that we have with technology right now. The fact that it's moving so fast that we can't always think through or prepare for the implications of what this might bring. Politically, fake news, meddling with disruptions, the opportunity to use these technologies that have been used so much for good for such a long time for nefarious reasons. The unpreparedness we have for being addicted to our smartphones, things like that, how those have societal change is actually a function of this disparity in that graph. But it also creates massive challenge and opportunity for business. Most businesses can't change at the rate of technology. I think a few of you are very aware of that given the work that you do in this office. Many of you are responsible for helping organizations that move at this pace move faster. Some of you are responsible for helping technology and companies that actually start at this point of the curve continue with the pace of that curve. And companies that have embraced an agile mindset are able to kind of raise that curve to a certain extent to keep above and faster than the competition. Being agile is very important, but being agile is not enough. Agile is not the idea or the framework that Uber used to come up with its business, but it's a great way to respond to disruption, but it isn't a way to keep ahead of disruption. It's a great way to keep pace, but not always to keep ahead of the benchmark that we see here. Being able to anticipate, being able to think where are things going and what might converge when, that's actually how you keep pace with the curve like this. When we think about the way we think about challenges, one of the most important things about the way we look at those is we're not good at thinking exponentially. We think linearly. We go through a day in a linear fashion. We have 24 hours, 365 days a year. We circle the sun at the same path all the time. Individually, we think about things in sequence. I do this, then that, then that. I build equations. I build programs in a linear way. I do this, then that, then that. But thinking about things exponentially is very, very difficult. If I think about the distance of 30 steps, I know pretty much how far that's going to be. That's going to be about 30 yards, a little bit past the dividing wall in this room. I can get there in about probably 20, and then past the exit sign. That's 30 steps. How about 30 exponential steps? Does anyone here have an idea what the distance is of 30 exponential steps? I'll give you a second to think about it. There's a lot of really smart brains in this room, so this might come faster than I think it will. Just a guesstimate. California? Longer than California? Shorter than California? I promise I won't razz you if you get it wrong. Who thinks it's the distance of the world to the sun, different galaxy, different state? Where would you put that? Different state to the moon? Is that what I heard? Yep. So 30 exponential steps would essentially be to the moon, back to the Earth, and back to the moon again. That's an amazing distance. Essentially, when we look at the exponential progress of numbers, we don't think about it. It's 2, 4, 6, 8, all the way up to a billion when you're looking at to the 30th power. 10 million, 1,000 million, billion. It's a massive difference. Now you're starting to take a look at that problem I just had of looking at things through exponential steps, and I looked really silly doing it. But now when you take a look at the step of 1 to 30, 1 to a billion, it starts to change the frame of it, and it looks a little less ridiculous based on how I got from an acorn to the international conflict in society, because you're looking at things through an exponential lens. And we're actually really bad at this all across the board. It's not just people who don't think this way. It's often it's experts in an industry. The chart I'm about to show you is several years of predictions from an organization that specializes in monitoring energy production and energy policy, the International Energy Association. And what they do is they make predictions every year. This one specifically about the growth of solar. And let's make sure that this is going to, there we go. So from 1995 to 2035, this is the actual growth, exponential, right? Now we look at the predictions, which are going to come up in a moment. These aren't exponential. These are linear. We have the data, but we're starting at a point we think, OK, based on today's data, we're going to go linearly in this direction. OK, well, now we have more data, and it's still exponential, but we're still going linear. These are people with 30 years of experience in the industry tracking energy trends and being able to understand how much energy we're adding to the solar grid and capacity. You think they'd be able to say, OK, my data says this moves exponentially. Even though the exponential trend is really low here, it still looks very much like 0, almost linear. OK, I can forgive these first 6 estimates. I get it. But now when you have data of years on years of things moving exponentially, you should retrain your model. Your lens needs to change, but they're not. And the problem with estimates like this is this affects policy. This affects people like you and me. This affects what kind of things our countries invest in. So being able to think exponentially, think linearly, is important for the problems we all face, not just the things we do in our workday. So again, thinking exponentially, not easy for any of us, but it's something we can keep reminding ourselves to do. When it comes to thinking about the future, it's not about getting the right answer. The value in thinking about the future is in changing the way that we think. I just showed a glaring example of how we're really bad at doing things that will help us inform the way that we operate in the future. But overall, we're still bad at it. We know that things move exponentially, but how do we plan for that? How do we force ourselves to think that way every single day? It's not, again, in getting the right answer, but if we can prepare ourselves to think that way and even think about possibilities, when the future looks similar or has some signals of what we thought about in the past, we can start to adapt to that, even if it doesn't look exactly the way we whiteboarded. That has a massive impact on our own preparedness, the way things change. I'm going to show an example of a company I think is doing a very good job of this. Domino's Pizza. Domino's, in 2010, realized they had a problem. Our product is garbage. Everybody knew it. They built a campaign on it. They even apologized to everyone who had bought a pizza. They re-engineered the pizza, but that wasn't enough. The product itself wasn't enough for them to change the business. They realized we're not in the pizza game. We're in the convenience game. And by changing the lens of which they operate, they realized they could play a completely different game than all of their competitors. Pizza Hut, Papa John's. Actually, I don't know if they were around 2010. They might have been. But by changing that lens and saying, you know what? We're a technology company, not a pizza company. I would argue they're actually not a technology company. I would say they're a convenience company that happens to use technology to sling pizza. And by becoming a convenience or technology company, now you're focused on how do I make things more convenient for my consumers at all costs. Think Amazon, one-click button. How do I create that for my business? And they've created all sorts of opportunities, from autonomous driving to get your pizza to the door to unmanned drones to get your pizza to the door. If you had thought about unmanned drones delivering your pizza 10 years ago, you'd be like, that is the dumbest thing I have ever heard. In no way, shape, or form will that ever happen. And in certain areas, this is actually the predominant way to get your pizza delivered with some of the Domino's tests. Now they become a big data company. How many of you saw their commercial on the Super Bowl where they talk about taking pictures of pizzas? Anybody? Few people? Essentially what they did is they created a commercial which they spent $6 million on airtime saying, hey, if you go somewhere else that's not ours, take a picture of that pizza and send it in, we'll still give you points for free pizza with us. Most people thought that this was a play just to get you to engage with Domino's more frequently. From a brand perspective, that's really smart. Even if I'm not with you, I'm going to engage with you, you're top of mind, I might buy from you next time. But what's really happening here is they're getting hundreds of thousands of photos of people eating pizza in all different contexts. I now understand exactly how you eat pizza when you're not with me. You might be getting pepperoni with me, but you're getting Hawaiian with the person you're cheating on me with. Oh my gosh. Now I know where you're eating pizza, how many people you're eating pizza with, what context you're eating pizza in, geo-tagged information. Where are you typically? When I anonymize all that information, I get massive patterns in this data from a really interesting way of just saying, hey, we want to give you free pizza. In exchange, I know so much more about your pizza eating habits. This is the kind of big data that most companies would love to have. And it turns the problem of, I'm not a big data company, I know data is important, but I'm a CPG. I could never get that kind of information. Or I'm a company that has no access to this type of data. Domino's created an opportunity for people to give them data. They're not Google. You're not signing a privacy disclosure agreement with them, no end user license agreement with Domino's, but you still have an opportunity to give them the data to create a personalized experience for them. And that was ingenious thinking, if I have to say so myself. Had nothing to do with it, by the way. So going back to Martech's law, Scott Brinker, who's the person who essentially built the concept, we can't really adopt all technological change. It's just too much happening too fast, but we can strategically choose the ones that we go after. And that's something that Domino's does really, really well, because they make small strategic bets. They have this idea called Anywhere. They're creating an application layer on top of their business. You can one touch, one click, one tweet, one Slack order on almost any platform, whether it's on your smartwatch or in your car. And by doing this, they make it, again, unbelievably convenient to be able to get their product without thinking at all. Not because I really want a Domino's pepperoni tonight, but I just really want something simple. Cool, it's on its way. Being able to do that has a miraculous effect on your relationship with your customer, but also changing the game. You're, again, not a pizza company. This one usually gets people all riled up. Uber's not a technology company. They've never been a technology company. Uber is a logistics company that moves product from point A to point B. That product can be people, it can be food, logistics, or anything else they can dream up. They just happen to use technology as a tool to do so. And that's part of the challenge with the way we look at these companies. We call them tech companies. They're modern companies. that use tech as a tool. There aren't many other industries where we say, your screwdriver makes you a screwdriver company. You use a screwdriver. It's far more practical than using your thumb. It's a definitive advancement. Therefore, you're a screwdriver company. It didn't happen like that. But we kind of do that with technology because it's a different way of producing work more effectively. They are, again, a logistics company. By looking at what we do and how we serve our customers and the way they relate to us, we can change the frame of, oh, I'm just a tech company. What does that even mean? We use tech to serve our needs. And AI is the same way. Virtual reality is the same way. Augmented reality, they're tools to create an experience of some kind. AI, for many people, is this black box that could eventually become the Ultron overlord of a universe and eventually make me subservient to its whims. Okay, we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves right now, but by giving it that, ascribing it to this tech thing that I can't understand, automatically removes me from being able to A, understand it, and B, participate in the conversations that will help shape it. By treating it as an other versus a tool that we can use, that changes the relationship with it. And language is so important. Language defines the aperture at which we look at things. Whether we look at things up close, whether we keep them in focus, whether we have a shallow depth of field, our language defines our relationship with technology. A long time ago, you used to say, oh, I'm going to go online and get directions to the place I'm going today. I'm going to sign on to AOL, I'm going to go to MapQuest, and I'm going to print them out. The idea of going online isn't a thing that we do anymore. It's a thing that we are. We are online all the time. To make another analogy that I'll steal from Walt Mossberg, you wouldn't say, honey, would you like me to go on the electrical grid today and make you some toast? It just sounds so awkward, but a long time ago you might have said, I'm going to go on the electrical grid today. I'm going to see what this thing does. And all of a sudden it's pervasive. It becomes part of the infrastructure of who we are as human beings. And technology is doing the same thing. Connectivity is doing the same thing. And it's really important, again, going back to how we refer to these things as tools or as an other, more amorphous product, that defines our relationship with it. And it's very important to me that we change our lens, that we flip the problem in ways that we can look at it differently and start to understand the texture and the dynamic of those challenges differently than what they're just presented to us. If we accept things at face value, that it's an acorn, we don't know what it can be. We don't know what it can produce, and we don't know the utility that it can provide for us. So with that, I like to dive into two trends that I'm actually following pretty closely for some of the clients that we're working on, and those are generative AI, or AI in general, really, and immersive content. So when we talk about AI, this particular example, how many of you have been to the website thispersondoesnotexist.com? There's a few people here, so you know exactly what this is. Again, none of these people exist. They are manufactured. Now, it may seem like you have seen people like this before because you have seen people like this before. This is essentially trained on probably some like IMDb or something because they are all way too attractive to be the average person. But it's an essentially machine learning algorithm that went through and said, okay, I'm going to understand what makes up a facial structure and then be able to recreate that. So one thing to learn it, it's another thing to generate it. They introduced a technology called Google Duplex, which essentially allows them to really take their assistant to the next level. And I'll show you what they demoed on stage. Oh, do I have audio? There we go. Hopefully it's loud enough for you here in the back.
So what you're going to hear is the Google Assistant actually calling a real salon to schedule an appointment for you. Let's listen.
How can I help you? Hi, I'm calling to book a woman's haircut for a client. I'm looking for something on May 3rd. Sure, give me 1 second. Sure, what time are you looking for around? At 12 p.m. We do not have a 12 p.m. available. The closest we have to that is a 1:15. Do you have anything between 10 a.m. and 12 p.m.? Depending on what service she would like, what service is she looking for? Just a woman's haircut for now.
That was crazy. The next demo that they had was making a reservation in a Chinese restaurant that does not accept open table reservations, navigating dynamic situations with human speech without being able to tell it's a robot. That's crazy. Now they're dealing with whether or not you announce this as a robot or not. This year at Google I/O, they announced Google Duplex for the web, so it can actually take care of tasks for you. We will all have a personal assistant within the next several years, which is something that 10 years ago we would have said, yeah, maybe in 2055 we'll all have personal assistants. It will happen by 2021, and it'll be really effective. That pace of change is insane, but it also creates all sorts of new questions that we have to solve for. Do you announce that this is a robot that's making a phone call? How am I going to feel when my friend has their Google Assistant call me saying, hey, Ian, Robbie would like to have lunch with you next week, but doesn't have the kindness to call you personally and wants me to navigate that conversation with you. Robbie, I'm sure you'll do that to me. But it changes our relationship, again, not just with code, but with other people, because we have code doing more human-like activity. Another example is essentially using reference files. This I love. This was showed at the Adobe Summit, or Adobe Max, not too long ago, with one of my favorite actors. And they were demonstrating some Skunkworks projects. And this is about taking a reference file and applying it to almost any output. This is something that you used to have really good skills in Photoshop for, have some artistic ability as well, and a lot of time.
Which in fact is quite a hard case. So let's see what we can get.
And this software you can use right now. This is Adobe Character Animator. This is available in its current iteration.
Wow. So,
essentially clicking a button. Now, we kind of do this with things like Instagram lenses and Snapchat, but those are highly developed. Those take sometimes weeks to develop. This is something that's taking that development time down to minutes. And if you want to, you can take it to the next step with real time.
So let's switch to Character Animator. And you can see that it's actually picking what I say, and I'm driving this puppet, although the ambient sound here is a little bit distracting. And this only took me a couple of minutes to create these scenes with Puppet Run. So here I am as a guy from a classical painting, so I can enjoy my outfit from whatever century that is.
So again, very impressive, very adaptive, taking something that not until too long ago took weeks of coding in teams to build. Now I have essentially a Photoshop filter kind of experience that can help me do it at the drop of a hat, just because the machines are now learning how to do things that I had to build myself a long time ago. This next example, as a former musician, somebody who used to make a living doing that, this kind of kills me a little bit, but it's really cool to see the resources, especially for things like filmmakers who are trying to create more immersive experience. This is called Iva. This is an artificial intelligence composer that can create music of almost any genre. And what you hear here is like a cinematic soundtrack. And it, of course, using a reference file of hundreds of thousands of songs. Sounds like a very dramatic scene. And now I'm going to ratchet up the tension and shift to a different scene. As an editor of film, I can take this technology and say, based on the way I'm going to edit my film that I'd used with my Canon 60D or 6DS, I can now use artificial intelligence to score my movie. I no longer have to hire Hans Zimmer at $5 million an hour to do that. Now, it may not eliminate composers right away. In fact, it may even create more jobs for people to have the ability to compose. But now, creating a really interesting soundtrack that drives the emotion of my film, which I can do on a weekend, is available in a program like Final Cut Pro or Final Cut X. That's amazing. It's democratizing that technology at the same time, creating all sorts of questions of, I spent 20 years building expertise in how to do this. Where does that put me? And this is happening all over the place. The next area we spend a lot of time in our lab is on immersive content creation. This is a ton of fun. This is really kind of the future of not just cinema, but the future of the experience of content everywhere. Right now, we tend to think of digital experience as this thing that happens behind a screen. it's behind glass, it's on a monitor, it's on your phone. And that's going to change rapidly over the next couple of years. And you can see the beginnings of it with things like augmented reality, being able to project information onto the world around you through your phone. And eventually things like Magic Leap, when it's beyond the alpha product stage that it is now, to other things that will have even more robust effects. This is next generation cinema filmed in 3D. What you see here is not done at a Hollywood studio. This is done at Intel. This is essentially a soundstage where they have a number of actors performing a scene. There is no cinematographer in the room, and the director's behind a computer screen. With this, they're actually doing this inside a globe dome with hundreds of cameras stitching together frames at the same time. Their post-processing facility looks like this entire floor with a bunch of computers processing all that information and creating a 60 frame per second composite of every single angle of that camera. Let me show you what that looks like. This is just one angle of the new Intel cinema facility. And what you'll see in this example is not just 3D cinema, but holographic production. What will life be like when you can actually interact with a hologram of yourself sitting on that chair and be able to experience them in real physical space?
But you have to
find out.
stay in this little circle in order for the cameras to see you.
Last month, we followed Ashley as she made her 4th trip to AI, this time with her now youngest child, Wilder. Being recorded isn't any different than normal video, which I happen to know because I've had a hologram of myself made before. What is different, though, is what it's like to experience it afterwards.
Whoa, this is so cool. And it's so nice to see the little her again. Looking at a flat image, it's just way different. She's changed.
That's cool. But it's also crazy because it changes, again, our understanding of what it's like to relate not only to other people, but to ourselves. And this seems like it's something that's really difficult to do. You'd have to go spend thousands of dollars at AI to do that right now. But eventually, thinking again exponentially, in 10 years, that technology will be available on your phone. Oh wait, actually, similar technology already exists on your phones today. This is an app called Scandy, which I used in 5 seconds to create a point cloud model of the above my shoulders. Now, obviously, I had a little bit of an issue with the back of my head. You can see that's kind of blown out. But I can take a model like this, I can throw it into 3D and have it do all sorts of things very, very quickly. And that's just using the front-facing camera and the depth sensor on my iPhone 10. Google has similar technology. You can use this in a number of different places. But the technology that we're seeing in those massive studios is available at some level to consumers who want to play around with this kind of stuff. You don't need to wait 10 years for a Hollywood studio to bring that to you. You might not be able to make it Hollywood studio quality, but this stuff exists today for us. Beyond just thinking about content generation, we can also use these tools for new creative possibilities, new content creation opportunities, changing the way we think about how we film and how we produce content. And in VR, this is a phenomenal example from Mercedes. This is a commercial that they produced for the Masters last year. Some of you might have seen this, but essentially it's part of their Can't campaign. The audio doesn't work on this, but otherwise you'd hear John Hamm waxing philosophical about how Kant is a dare. Looks like it's built entirely in Cinema 4D, CGI, all on computers. Partially. The model of the AMG was actually produced using a Leica LiDAR, which essentially produces 2 million points of geospatial data per second and creates an incredibly high fidelity map of an object. I can do that with a $500 machine if I want to and hand scan things to create 3D models. They used a $25,000 device to do that. Well, all of a sudden they can put this model of the AMG device, instead of having someone spend weeks painstakingly recreate it from renders that they used to design the car, they can simply scan it, put it in a virtual environment, and then start to film.
Try to make camera moves that are linear and then kind of move them a little bit to make them feel more real. On this project, we utilized the new system in the VR world. You could step into a wireframe reality and able to scale the car up and down so that I could, give a handheld shot over the top of the car.
I'm afraid to walk. It feels like I'm gonna fall down.
Yes, sorry about that, man.
No, that's good.
when Paul was doing one of the shots, he kept on walking around the car, and with a little push, he walked into it. All of a sudden, he realized, oh, I can get inside this car, point my camera up at the top, and actually pull it like a crane shot straight through the vehicle. Impossible any other way, but a revelation.
So creating new opportunities to do things with hundreds of thousands of dollars of tool sets that you couldn't do otherwise. This VR prototype allows you to imitate the type of camera you want to use, an ARRI Alexa, which starts at $45,000 just for the body alone, what kind of lenses and aperture you want to use, all recreated through software. On top of that, my ability to get into the scene and change the way that I film is completely different in a virtual environment. Again, changing the lens of what's possible within the physical space. Moving even further forward, we've seen a lot of things that look impressive, but they look like they're created by computers. They look like they belong in CG environments. The idea of creating a photorealistic environment where you can't tell the difference between what's real and what's fake feels a little bit far off. It feels like we're getting there, but we're not there yet.
The ability to learn from past experience.
This is a demo reel from a company called Quixel, which makes essentially a 3D engine that sits on top of Unreal 4. Both of them are available right now for download to create virtual worlds that look precisely real. Built-in physics, built-in lighting. Somebody who does not have programming experience essentially could spend a few weekends getting up to speed to create something like this. Feels very futuristic, very Blade Runner dystopian. But if you want to build it, it's kind of like the 3D version of Photoshop.
From day one, you can focus your
I want some grass in that area, I'll just paint it. I need more rock here, I'll be able to take a model and expand it and contract it.
We are one step closer to fully interactive worlds, indistinguishable from reality. And the good thing is, with Unreal Engine and Megascans, we're able to build it with ease. Stay tuned for tutorials this summer. This is Joe Garth from Quixel, signing off. Until next time.
If any of you are interested in that, I highly recommend checking it out. It's really cool stuff. They use a library called Megascans, which essentially becomes like the Wikipedia of physical textures around the world. People are scanning environments all the time, scanning objects, so you can take them and recreate them in a real physical, in a digital world. This is essentially the future of immersive content creation, whether it's augmented reality or virtual reality, and that's going to take things to the next step very, very quickly. So again, we talked about the pace of change a number of times. Hopefully, over the last half hour, I've illustrated the point that the way we look at the challenge is really the important thing. What lens am I putting on the challenge I'm approaching? Am I looking at it specifically as what I think it is, or am I looking at it for what it can be? And what does that mean for the way I should design around that challenge? And what does that mean to my business? So with that, I say thank you very much for having me here. If you have any questions about the resources, again, please hit me up on Twitter, and I'd like to open up for questions. This is usually the point where there's an awkward silence for about 30 seconds until someone asks. Yes?
So I was wondering, when you were talking about exponential change,
Yeah.
Is it still important for business model innovation to happen like through strategy, or do you think technology is leading it? Because with respect, even with respect to the Domino's example, you mentioned that they realized they were not a pizza company as such, but a
Yes.
convenience company, and that's when the tech came in to make it happen. So do you think that's going to change anytime in the future, or do you think it's still going to be important to have that core business strategy in place?
Absolutely. So for those in the back who might not have heard the question was, given the pace of change, is it still important for business model ideation and change to happen through strategy or through technology? And that actually goes back to the slide I had a while ago about planning and making, strategy and technology. You can kind of put those two things at within the same equation, and it's not about either or one or the other. It's about how do they work together and how do they blur that line? How do they deliberately come together where there's this area of understanding of I do what you do what I do, and we actually speak the same language. So strategically, they changed the way that they looked at the problem and said, we are no longer a pizza company, we are a technology company. From a technology perspective, then they used that as a tool to solve that challenge. But it goes, again, back to the idea that technology is a tool. Technology itself is not a strategy, but it's a way to achieve a strategy. Looking at the lens of what is the problem, what is our frame on that problem, and then what are we going to do to essentially solve for that, that creates the way to get from point A to point B. Absolutely. I saw a few other hands up. Absolutely.
As individuals in our own little boxes, what's exponential step one look like?
Absolutely. So it goes again to widening that aperture. We tend to focus very specifically on one thing. We look at the world with blinders on. It's the same thing in the office, and that's universal. I have found very few companies that are amazingly good at making sure that people are communicating properly and that everyone understands what else is happening. One great way is honestly having opportunities for people who wouldn't normally interact together to work on small projects together. And sometimes even switching up the roles. In projects that are a little bit more elementary and problems that don't require great depth of experience to solve, having people take on the role of a project manager when I'm actually a developer or a creative when I'm a strategist can switch the frame, and oftentimes you become the wrong person asking the right questions. And that's incredibly valuable. To think that I have a depth of expertise in this and therefore I have the right answer, especially in the pace of change, not just technology, but the way everything is happening now, that often isn't as worthwhile as being able to look at things differently and offer solutions and suggestions that might not otherwise come to bear. Yes?
As a leader, how do you get people who maybe don't feel comfortable or it's not natural for them to take that kind of step into that kind of odd role? How do you encourage them?
So is that question more about like getting people together, or once they're together, actually getting them to engage that way? So oftentimes it comes down to the personal relationships between people who are swapping roles. So if I am the strategist, getting to know the person who's going to be taking on my role as a strategist and the creative, so I'll have the creative talking to the strategist and vice versa, and helping actually guide them through how they would do something can create an understanding of A, what I do as a creative, how do I look at the world as a creative, and then giving them kind of the space to work on their own. There's a bit of a mentorship there, but also just a dynamic of, hey, I can go and get a coffee with you and talk about what I do and how I do it at a different level now, because you understand what my challenges are and how I look at the world. So that alone creates a fluidity of the relationship and the knowledge within an organization. It doesn't fix it in one step. It's definitely kind of thing that requires an evolution and a lot of time for that knowledge to start to become a little bit more diffuse. But I wouldn't prescribe one particular way of doing things for an organization. I've done some of that with our agency. So an example, we have a center of excellence, but within our own department, we do the role swapping. When we start to expand that outside of the department itself and we start to bring more creatives in, we might not do something as overt as saying, you're now the strategist, but asking them to do small things in the way of, okay, so I'm going to have you develop like the user journey for this particular experience from when they actually get the banner ad through when they're actually in front of the product in aisle. And I want you to think through that. I'm going to think about the design of the package of what I think is going to be the most important messaging on this tube of toothpaste to get them to look at it, pick it up, and touch it, because that's both a strategic and a creative process. So I'm going to do that. You do that, and then let's come back together and talk about it. And then when you explain to me, how did the person see the banner ad? Why did they go to the store? When they were in the store, was there an end cap display that they encountered that drove them to aisle? When they're in the aisle, what actually directed their attention to your specific packaging? And then what got them or motivated them to pick up that packaging, take a look at it and say, okay, I always get crests with scope, but there's a reason I took a look at something different today. What are the psychological reasons behind that? And I can start to walk them through and ask them questions from my own strategic perspective. They're like, man, okay, this is really tough and it's kind of frustrating, but you're asking me questions that I would never ever think about. And as a result, when I go back to actually designing that package of Crest with Scope and thinking about the banner ad that I'm going to design for Crest with Scope at CVS, all of a sudden I'm thinking about there's a bunch of decisions that have to happen before anyone even picks up this packaging. So that's an example in advertising and shopper marketing, totally different from an engineering challenge, but it's an opportunity to get people to think, okay, I'm going to do something and we're going to kind of walk each other through it. And honestly, if someone's not a designer, have them design something in PowerPoint. Everybody can create boxes and text in PowerPoint. It doesn't have to be pretty. Great question, though. Yeah? Robbie.
How do you explain to a client this whole exponential theory? Well, basically, a lot of the clients I'm assuming saying, I want more acorns, just make me more acorns. And I can't really tell them, well, I don't want to get you more acorns because I want to prevent a world war from happening. So how do you?
Yes.
How would you present like that? How would we, like, in that environment where obviously we don't allow somebody the opportunity to like swap rules like that? Like I just have to build acorns, I have to build how do you navigate that relationship with?
Absolutely. So we have a number of clients ourselves that are like, hey, we have a challenge that we know is going to be really, it's important now, but it's going to be massive for us soon. So let's take the elder care space. There is an understanding within the space that there's a huge shortage of labor. There's not enough people to fill the roles to actually take care of the people who want to be residents. There's not always enough actual locations for proper elder care. There's a number of things that technology can solve for it, but a lot of elder care organizations aren't really thinking about the potential of a model like an Airbnb or some other company creating an application layer on top of their business and completely just burning them to the ground. When you think about what's happened in other industries, you can kind of show them that direct line between what a business model from an external competitor could do to you, but the stepwise motion is often, okay, here's an example of a 400-year-old organization taking innovation and using that innovation to kind of step them out of the mode they're in and prepare for this eventual future. Getting them to understand that innovation oftentimes inside the organization will actually be attacked by the immune system of the corporate culture is important. So saying, hey, the same people that got you here and have been here for 20 years are probably not the same people that need to decide what the business model looks like in the future. So getting them outside of that group and giving them a space to work autonomously is going to be key. But the idea of changing their perspective on innovation, which I think is more of what you're asking for, being able to show them specific examples, first within their industry, because like attracts like. I get the challenges of other people in my industry. Okay, I can see that. What have they done from an innovation perspective that's helped get them an advantage or change the direction of their business? Awesome. That's going to be from get me more acorns to get me the red acorn, because now they have a red acorn, I want the red acorn. That's a stepwise motion to, okay, by the way, there's more than acorns. There are oak trees, and now all of a sudden there are pigs, and there are hens, and there are people. I want all those. So getting them to understand what can happen within their field, and then concentric rings outside. What are areas that affect your field that are changing rapidly? So robotics is a massive change within the elder care space that we're seeing in Japan right now. Japan's going to have a 2-to-1 retired to working population within the next 2 decades. They need people or need things to help take care of the aging population. And for them, they're focusing on robotics. And they're doing a damn good job of it. And we're seeing some of the same things start to happen in the US. Those trends can create the new concentric circle of, okay, aging population, we've seen some things from housing, we've seen some things from workforce. Within the specific frame of workforce, what's the next step of technology? Okay, let's dive into that and understand the texture of that change. Then reapply that change to my business and see what it means to the projection of my business. All of a sudden, I can't just look at the Excel sheet and say, well, the number of people that came in to my business today was X, the number of people who have left my business is Y, now I have to balance for that. That equation will run you into the ground very, very quickly if you're not looking at the concentric rings of how change is going to change the things tangential to you or surrounding you. That answer the question, John? Okay. These are great questions. Absolutely.
Is it necessary to cope up with the technology changes? All the companies that, so there are many technology that is coming up, and is it necessary to cope up with those changes? Like for example, if it's about AI.
Yeah.
There's like autonomous driving that is coming. So that would cause like all the truck drivers and all that to lose their jobs.
Yeah.
So that would have a massive impact on that as well. So is there a line where we could stop like coping up with the
Absolutely, we kind of have to. If we were machines, that'd be different. Or if we had Elon's neural lace, maybe we could just keep the programming coming in. The challenge is there's only so much bandwidth for us to think about these things and how important they are. There are people who specialize in looking at the broad view as a futurist of like, what are all the things that could affect all the things? But even they have to go to people with depth of expertise in certain things. I know very little about the infrastructure of how 5G actually works between millimeter wave and some of the other programs that are being used in Europe or Asia. I know they exist, but I don't know how it exists. So there's a depth challenge of how far do you go, and then there's a breadth challenge of how far do you go. And for me, the way I look at it is, if you're not doing this professionally, focus on things that interest you, and also focus on things that you think might be relevant to what you do professionally and how those might challenge you. And then maybe go a little bit outside of that, because that'll constantly push your boundaries. But to hold yourself responsible for knowing about all the change is simply impossible. And that line is kind of something you have to negotiate yourself on your own of like, how much time am I willing to put into this? How much effort? How much do I want to read? And how passionate am I about it? For me, like, I love this stuff, and I could talk about it all day long, but not everybody is as nerdy as I am when it comes to that kind of stuff. I do believe, though, what's important is that we all start having conversations about what these changes mean. I brought up a number of examples of things that kind of change our relationships with each other and our digital devices. The thing about the future is it doesn't just arrive fully formed. That's a quote from Amy Webb, whose book I just pulled earlier. I highly recommend it. But the future is something that arrives because we have experience with it. We have conversations about what should it look like. We make choices about the design of our tools, and there are humans behind those decisions. It's the people in this room. It's us. We get to decide what we want the future to look like by talking to politicians, by talking to the engineers who are creating these tools, by actively participating ourselves, by having a knowledge of what that change looks like and where things are going. That helps immensely in navigating that conversation.